In the summer of 1994, a man named Walter Haze sat down in a lawn chair outside a double-wide trailer in Deming, New Mexico, hooked a microphone to his collar, and said, "I held its hand, and it looked at me. And I knew right then that nothing I had ever been told about anything was true." He was dying of pancreatic cancer. He had maybe 4 months. He had nothing left to protect. What he said next has never been officially acknowledged. The tape came to me through a circuitous route that I still don't fully understand. A researcher named Donna Falk, operating out of Albuquerque, had been quietly collecting deathbed testimonies from former military personnel for the better part of a decade. Men and women who had served in the American Southwest during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many of them stationed at or near Roswell Army Air Field in New Mexico. She wasn't looking for sensation. She was, by her own description, a retired archivist with a surplus of time and a nagging conviction that the official record was riddled with gaps. She found Walter Haze in July of 1994 through a mutual acquaintance, a former quartermaster sergeant who had served at White Sands Proving Ground, and who told Donna over the phone that there was a man she needed to meet before the cancer finished the job. She drove 5 hours. She set up a recorder. And Walter Haze talked for 4 hours and 11 minutes without stopping. I have heard that tape. Not all of it is coherent. Some sections are lost to wind interference. In one long stretch, perhaps 40 minutes, the audio quality degrades into something that sounds almost deliberate, a kind of warbling distortion that Donna's sound technician later described as consistent with magnetic interference. Whether that interference was accidental or something else is a question I'm not equipped to answer definitively, but enough of it is clear. Enough of it is devastating, and that's where Walter Haze becomes impossible to ignore. Let me tell you what he describes, not in abstractions, not in the vague, hedged language of men who are afraid. Walter Haze describes specifics, he gives dates, he gives locations within locations, not just Roswell, but specific coordinates within the base, building designations, shift schedules, the names of the sandwiches served in the commissary on the morning of July 9th, 1947. He describes being summoned. He was 23 years old. He had been stationed at Roswell Army Air Field for 14 months, working as a security perimeter guard, the most unremarkable of assignments. Walk the fence, check the gate, sign the clipboard. He was not an officer. He was not a scientist. He was not, by any conventional measure, the kind of man you would select for something extraordinary, which is, he suggests, precisely why they selected him. They needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, he says on the tape. Someone who hadn't yet learned to be ambitious. I was just a kid from Dothan, Alabama, who knew how to follow orders and keep his mouth shut. On the morning of July 9th, 2 days after the initial recovery of the crash debris from the Foster Ranch outside Corona, New Mexico, Walter Haze was pulled from his regular rotation by a man he identifies only as the Major. He is careful not to give a full name. Whether this is a choice born of loyalty, fear, or fading memory is unclear. He refers to him as the Major throughout all 4 hours of the recording. The Major brought him to a section of the base that Walter had never accessed, Building 84. He had walked past it dozens of times. It appeared unremarkable. A low concrete structure, no windows, a single door, no signage beyond a standard restricted area placard that was, Walter notes, identical to the ones posted outside the motor pool and the quartermaster's warehouse. That's the thing nobody understands, he says. They hid it in the ordinary. They put it right next to everything else. No fanfare, no extra guards, just a door that looked like every other door on that base. He was told only 2 things before he went inside. Do not speak to it. Do not touch it unless it reaches for you first. The deeper you go into Walter's account, the more it resists easy categorization. He is not describing the wide-eyed, silver-skinned entities of science fiction. He is describing something more disquieting than that, something more specific. There were 2 of them initially, he says. One was unresponsive, lying on a table, covered by what he describes as a heavy canvas sheet. motionless in a way that he understood immediately to be permanent, dead, or something like dead. I don't know if they die the way we die, he says, but whatever it wasn't moving, and everyone in the room treated it like a thing. Not a body, a thing. The other one was seated. Walter spends nearly 20 minutes describing this being, and I want to be careful here. Not to embellish, not to dramatize, but to relay what he actually says, in the order he says it, because the sequence of his observations matters. He doesn't begin with the eyes or the head, the way a person inventing a story might. He begins with the hands. Its hands were in its lap, he says, and the first thing I thought, the very first thing, was that they looked tired, the way your grandmother's hands looked tired, like they'd done too much for too long. The hands were pale. Not white, pale. The colour, he says, of old newspaper left in the sun. The fingers were longer than human fingers, but not grotesquely so. 4 of them. No visible nails. The knuckles were pronounced in a way that made him think of erosion, of stone worn smooth by water over a very long time. He stood at the door for what he estimates was 3 minutes before he walked closer. Nobody told him to. Nobody told him not to. It turned its head when I moved, he says. Not fast, slow, like it had been expecting me for a while and wasn't in a hurry about it. Here is where the official explanation, such as it is, completely breaks down. Because what Walter describes next is not a passive specimen. It is not a body recovering from trauma, not a non-responsive entity behaving according to some animal instinct. What he describes is deliberate, attentive, curious. It looked at me the way you look at something you've already figured out, he says. Not like it was studying me, like it had finished studying me and was just looking, patient. He was inside Building 84 for approximately 3 hours on that first day. First day, because there was a second day, and a third. This raises a critical but simple question. Why Walter? He asks it himself on the tape. He spent 47 years asking it, and the answer he eventually arrives at is the one that unsettles me most, because it is not dramatic, it is bureaucratic. According to Walter, a base physician, a man he calls Doc Reeves, determined within the first 12 hours of contact that the being responded differently to different individuals. To officers, to scientists, to most of the personnel who cycled through Building 84 in those initial days, it was unresponsive. Still. Present but sealed. To Walter, it oriented. Doc Reeves said it was probably my age, Walter recalls. That I was closer to something, some frequency, he said. I don't know what that means. I didn't know then either. But they kept bringing me back. He became, in effect, its guard, its companion, its point of contact, though that phrase implies a two-way communication that Walter is at pains to both affirm and complicate throughout the recording. We didn't talk, he says, not with words, but I'd be lying if I told you nothing passed between us. Something passed between us every single day. He guarded the being for 22 days. 22 days. And here's the strangest part. There are no records. Not of Walter's reassignment, not of Building 84's modified access logs for July and August of 1947. Donna Falk spent 3 years submitting Freedom of Information Act requests, targeting the relevant date ranges and personnel rosters for Roswell Army Air Field. What she received, pages of heavily redacted documents in early 1997, contained a gap, July 8 through August 3, 1947. A gap of 26 days in the official duty logs for a base that was otherwise documented with bureaucratic obsessiveness. 26 days. Walter was there for 22 of them. The silence in those documents is deafening. On the 19th day, and he is precise about this, he has counted it, recounted it, apparently spent decades counting it, the being reached for him. Walter had been sitting in a folding chair approximately 4 feet from where the being was seated. This was their routine. He would arrive at 0600, he would sit, the being would orient toward him. They would remain like that, in the silence that Walter increasingly describes not as emptiness, but as fullness, until his shift ended at 1400. On the 19th day, the being extended its hand. It moved slow, he says. Everything it did was slow, like it was being careful with us, like it knew we were fragile and it didn't want to break anything. Walter reached back. I know I wasn't supposed to initiate, but it had reached first. That was the rule, and I wasn't afraid. That's the thing I want people to understand. I should have been afraid, and I wasn't. I was calm. I was the calmest I have ever been in my entire life. Their hands made contact. The being's fingers, 3 of them, he says, curling around the back of his right hand, while the 4th remained extended, were warm. Not body temperature warm. Warmer than that. He says it felt like holding something that had been sitting in the sun, and then he stops talking for almost a full minute on the tape. When he resumes, his voice is different, quieter, more careful. Something happened that I cannot explain to you in words, not because I don't want to, because words they're not built for it. It's like trying to describe a colour to someone who's never seen. I saw things, I felt things, whether it was putting them there or whether it was just opening a door I didn't know I had. I don't know. I don't know. He tries, over the next 37 minutes of the recording, to describe what he experienced during that contact. What emerges is fragmented, circular, sometimes contradictory, which is, paradoxically, what makes it feel credible. A fabricator constructs a coherent narrative. Walter Haze is trying to translate something for which he has no vocabulary, and the failure of his language feels like evidence of something real. He describes imagery. Not visions exactly, understanding, he says, in the form of imagery. Distances. He understood distances in a way that made the distance between the Earth and the Moon feel like the space between 2 adjacent chairs. He describes pattern. A sense of pattern so pervasive and so intricate that his own life, his childhood in Dothan, his 14 months at Roswell, his placement in that building on that morning, suddenly appeared to him not as accident but as something else. Not destiny, he is careful to say, something more mechanical than destiny, something more like precision. Like I had been placed there, he says, not chosen, placed, the way you place a tool where you're going to need it. The contact lasted, by his estimate, somewhere between 2 and 15 minutes. Time, he says, was behaving strangely. The being was gone by August 1st. Walter doesn't know how. He arrived on the morning of the 20th day, and building 84 was empty. Not reorganized, not vacated with the deliberateness of a relocation. Empty. The folding chairs were still there. The table was still there. The canvas sheet that had covered the motionless body was folded neatly in the corner. But everything else, the beings, the equipment that had surrounded them, the small cluster of medical personnel and observers who had occupied the room's periphery during Walter's visits, was gone. The door was unlocked. He walked in. He stood where he had sat for 19 mornings. He looked at the chair where it had been seated. I stood there for a long time, he says, and I felt, this is going to sound like nothing. I felt like I'd missed something important, like I'd almost understood something, and then it was taken away before I could finish understanding it. He was reassigned to fence patrol the following morning. No debrief, no official acknowledgement of what he had participated in. The major appeared once more, briefly, and told him, and this is Walter's precise recollection, "Son, the best thing you can do for yourself and for your country is to forget that you were ever cold." That phrase. Forget that you were ever cold. He never forgot it. He spent 47 years not forgetting it. The accumulation of what followed, a career, a marriage, children, grandchildren, the long, ordinary decades of a life lived in the American Southwest, none of it displaced what had happened in Building 84. If anything, the mundane weight of ordinary life made it more present, more insistent. Once you carry something like that, Walter says, you can't set it down. You can't unsee what was placed behind your eyes. I tried, he says quietly. Lord knows I tried. The deeper I went into the ancillary record, the fragmented documentation that surrounds the known events of July 1947, the more a specific pattern emerged, and the pattern does not repeat occasionally. It repeats with unsettling consistency. Personnel who were stationed at Roswell in the summer of 1947, and who later attempted to speak publicly, not in books, not in sensationalist venues, but in sworn affidavits, in deathbed recordings, in letters to congressmen and senators that were quietly referred back to the Department of Defense, share a remarkably uniform set of experiences in the aftermath. Reassignment within weeks of the event, separation from peers who had served alongside them, careers that were either prematurely ended or elevated in ways that insulated them from the civilian world, and, almost universally, a period of what Walter calls the forgetting years, a span of time, typically 5 to 10 years post-Roswell, in which their memories of the event became strangely inaccessible. Not suppressed, several of them note carefully, not traumatic amnesia, which has a recognizable texture, something different, something almost administered. Walter Haze describes this period as feeling like trying to remember a dream in the middle of another dream. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many others were there? How many Walter Hazes, ordinary men and women placed precisely, who held something extraordinary in their hands, and were then reassigned to fence patrol and told to forget they were ever cold? We don't know. We may never know. Because the evidence, the specific granular human evidence of individual experience, was not preserved. It was scattered. Men died, recordings degraded, letters were lost or confiscated, or simply never written, because the people who should have written them had been persuaded somehow that their experience was not the kind of thing you wrote down. And that is where the official account becomes impossible to accept at face value. Not because it lies outright, but because it leaves these people out entirely. It has no architecture for them. It was not designed to include them. And a record that systematically excludes the most intimate human evidence of an event is not a complete record. It is a selected one. Walter Haze died on November 14, 1994. Donna Falk attended the funeral in Deming. She was the only person present who knew what he had told her. She has shared the tape with 3 researchers over the past 3 decades, a number deliberately kept small, she explains, because she is not interested in sensation. She is interested in preservation. The tape exists. Copies exist. Their locations are known to people she trusts. Near the end of the 4-hour recording, Walter says something that I keep returning to, something that I cannot contextualize satisfactorily, no matter how many times I replay it. The worst part, he says, isn't that they took it away. The worst part is that I think it wanted to finish. I think it was trying to give me something specific, something it knew, something it came here knowing, and we ran out of time. And I've spent my whole life wondering what the last thing was, what it was trying to hand me at the end, whether it was something small or whether it was everything, whether I almost had everything and didn't know it. He pauses. I think about the other one, the one on the table, where it went, whether there's a place it went to, whether anything of what it knew made it back. Another pause. I hope something made it back. What do we do with Walter Haze? We can dismiss him. That is always available to us, the clean, frictionless exit of dismissal. An old man dying, who spent 47 years constructing a memory out of guilt and longing and the ordinary human need to have been part of something larger than himself. We can do that, but I keep coming back to the hands. He begins with the hands, not the eyes, not the head, the hands, the tired hands. He goes there first, the way a man goes to the detail that hit him hardest, the detail that lodged in him before he had time to craft it into something presentable. And I keep coming back to the phrase he uses, not once but 4 times over 4 hours, always unprompted, always with the same inflection. It was trying to give me something. Not communicate, not transmit, not signal, give. What was it? What knowledge arrived here, travelled whatever distance that distance represents, and then sat quietly in a folding chair in a concrete building in Roswell, New Mexico, waiting patiently for a 23-year-old boy from Dothan, Alabama, to be placed close enough to receive it? What was almost handed to us? To all of us, in those 19 days before everything went quiet and the canvas was folded into the corner and the door was left unlocked? And how many other buildings are there? How many other chairs? How many other moments where something waited with the patience of deep time for a human hand to reach back and then was taken away before the last thing could be said? Walter Haze died not knowing what he almost understood. I'm not sure we're supposed to know either, but I find myself unable to accept that nothing was lost. Something was lost. Something was lost in Building 84. On a morning in early August 1947, when a 23-year-old man arrived for his shift and found only folded canvas and silence, and a chair pointed at an empty wall. What it was remains, as of this moment, completely and perhaps deliberately unknown.